Hello, everybody, to Getting APIs to Work. Today, we say hello to Jason Harmon, CTO of Stoplight. Hey, Jason, how are you doing?
Good. Good morning.
Thanks for joining so early in your morning. And what we want to talk about today is top lessons from successful API programs. And the reason why I asked you to share a little bit of that with us is that Stoplight started a podcast series about 3.5 months ago. And by now you have, I think, around 10 episodes published. It was very interesting people, interesting content, and you produced all of these basically. So I'm sure you have a lot of takeaways. So today, I think you can share some of those. That would be great. So what was your initial idea even to get this started, right? It's quite a bit of investment, I think, in particular on the level that you're doing it. So I'm just wondering, why did that series even get started?
Yeah. I guess end of last year, I came on board as CTO at Stoplight, and we were talking about kind of ways to engage developer community. And really, the truth is our customers frequently, I guess for your listener awareness, Stoplight creates an API design platform, right? It's, kind of helps people standardize and collaborate, make things more discoverable, that sort of thing. But it's, effectively in some ways, it's a toolbox. And building an API program is a lot more than just a set of tools, right? So our customers have questions like, okay, great tools. How do I build a successful API program now? And so, and I should qualify, by the way, when you say, you produced, my only qualifier on this thing was like, we need help to do this the right way. And I don't have the time, right? I got an engineering team and these days a product team as well to run, right? So I got a day job. Let's make this easy. So I'm very lazy about it. I'm very lazy. Just make sure the AV works. But the spirit of why to do it was really to gather kind of knowledge from the community of API geeks like you and I on how do you stand this stuff up? What works, what doesn't, and figure out in some ways for ourselves too is like, is there consistency in approach to how people do things? Are there, like, I'm not a playbook kind of guy. I don't believe that there's one playbook that works for everything, but that there's maybe some fundamental principles that we can apply to that tend to work even at different scales. So that's kind of the spirit of questioning that we usually end up on with folks. And it's been interesting to see that there is some consistency, a lot of it. So, yeah.
I like that story, how you got into this, because for me, to be honest, it's kind of similar. It's like, for me, my little YouTube channel also is almost like an excuse to have interesting conversations with interesting people, and I have an excuse to do that. So, and it has been very interesting and enlightening to do that. You've been doing that over the last 4 months with a couple of people, and you just said, okay, there is some consistency, right? So that is always interesting when you start seeing patterns and things that repeatedly work or repeatedly don't work. Can you start sharing some of these observations that you've had? Because I think this really is kind of the big takeaway from maybe your first season, so to speak, right? It's like the patterns that start emerging.
Yeah, it seems like it's a good time to reflect on this stuff. It's been kind of, it took us, 3 months or so to get things up and running. Obviously, there's a lot of work to this stuff, and by the way, respect Eric, like, independent, running a YouTube channel, man. Like, some people may have seen I tried once, and it's like, man, it's a lot of work, and I just like literally published one YouTube video and walked. So now that I got help, it's doable. Yeah, it's funny because like we very much have just done it somewhat from the hip in terms of like, how do you do things, get kind of a walkthrough from these different folks on running, in some cases really big, very viable programs. But the only thing I've consistently asked to every one of them is like, okay, that's a big, complicated story. I love all of it. It sounds great. But for people listening, how would you get started? Like, if you had to start from scratch, everything's burned to the ground, right? Like, how do you rebuild from scorched earth? Or if you went back to maybe you're doing your own thing, you're off running a startup or something. How would you start building APIs? What would be most important that you learned from all that? And it's been super oddly consistent. I think the sort of my spiritual favorite, let's say, after years of doing this kind of work myself, and now trying to build a toolbox for folks to do it, is actually the one that we don't directly deal with at Stoplight, because I don't know if it makes sense to even need tools. It's have a consistent vocabulary for your company that's customer centric, right? And it's like, it seems so obvious. But I'm curious if you've seen this sort of thing too.
Yes, it's. I think where I see that most is when it comes to how do you even get for more business-oriented people and the more tech-oriented people, how can they start even talking about what they should be building? And very often there's just no overlap, right? The business-oriented people say, yeah, well, API sounds technical. It probably means something. You people go and do it, you IT folks, right? And then the IT folks, they really don't get as much input as they probably need. So yes, I definitely have seen that. And I think these attempts to try to create more overlap between those two groups, right? I think whatever you invest into these attempts, I think is money or effort so worth spent.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there's methodologies to doing this, and in the engineering world, we tend to lean on stuff like domain-driven design, right? And you'll see like event storming and some of these things, but it's like inevitably it ends up with a technical bent to it, and there's this orientation toward status quo systems is how you're going to think about it. As where if you get business folks together, they struggle to keep up with, it's like, wait, what is, why is isolation important? And, what is, like there's all these like CS concepts they need to know. So certainly from the PayPal experience, I learned from some really smart folks there that like this more business capability modeling oriented approach can be really effective to kind of engage both sides. Which is just to say, like, you're kind of not allowed to talk about systems. We're just describing a grammar, really. So it's, I think what's funny is most people who've gone through this and feel comfortable doing it say, like, once you've done it a bit, you don't need a bunch of methods. Get the right people in the right room and say, what are the things? What are the big things? And how do they relate to each other? And limit yourself on hierarchy. I usually like to limit to 3, right? Like, and I think for the engineer types, they go, oh, you're defining your domains and your primary entities, right? Well, yeah, but the customer abstraction level you need is typically more simplistic than it would be in kind of a proper domain model. So it's like getting language right. I think it's an essential element of building platforms, and not necessarily like APIs are just one of the things you use to build a platform, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because you mentioned that. I think things such as domain-driven design and event storming and all the other things, right? Like one of the problems with it, in my mind, is always that there are methods that have been created to build stuff, not just to design stuff, right? But they're really methods that you want to use all the way to actually building stuff. And I think that thinner slice where you say, I only want to know the surface of the thing, right? Like how it's getting built, like that's a different conversation for a different set of people. But I think that's kind of where the magic actually, that would be the perfect thing that would very consciously say, I don't care how it's going to get built, right? Yeah. All I want to know is what it does and what it can do for others.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, where these more engineering focused methods, there's nothing wrong with them, right? But I think they just have a focus that is not always the most helpful.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. Like I actually have a 21-year-old son he's in his like coming into his last year of his CS degree. And so I've been like following along because I don't have a CS degree. I didn't like, I'm a dropout, right? Like, I learned everything I know from a bunch of smart people. It's been interesting to see, like, even in the modern context, what they're learning. And it's like, there is this concept of designing things, and designing systems. And we think of it in the CS discipline as, well, you're designing something to perform optimally. And while that's true at some level, being able to understand a system and how it works is actually a far harder problem. I mean, how often do we see that we go build a stack, get it running, and then there's some change in personnel? That could be a reorg, that could be, you had some exodus and you had to backfill, or that could be you grew really fast and you hired a shit ton of people, right? And all of a sudden no one understands it, and you find yourself heading down these roads of rewriting all kinds of things because no one understood how it worked. And I don't think that's technical in nature. I think that's that you didn't understand the terminology used in most cases. It's right. Like, what is a, QSTR, right? Like, I guess it's a query string. So, and this is a well-known thing in CS that like naming is hard, right? But I think for me, the revelation in the last 5-10 years of doing this API stuff is when you put this interface strongly out there for, your customers to use, and this customer being a pretty loose term here, developers to consume, is it kind of needs to be self-explaining a little bit, right? And you need to use words that they know and use and relate those words in a way that makes sense to them and their problem space. So this whole like grammar vocabulary thing in APIs, I think for anybody that's done it for any length of time, you realize you got 5 different groups of people with 5 different groups of terminology, and they're all speaking in acronyms, and you're not going to get anywhere, right? So it's like, to some extent, get the right stakeholders in the room, get the marker board up, or these days with Zoom and, geographic distribution, right? Like, I love Miro, for example. I think it's been a super effective tool for a lot of people. Drop boxes, put titles on them, try to make it one word, try not to use conjoining language, and draw lines between them, and try not to make it too deep and complicated. Sounds simple, but man, it's so effective when you see it in action. So
yeah, I think that is definitely necessary to get the people together and to start sharing like what they think they're even doing. And I think sometimes it's also that when you see these API programs, sometimes in these, let's say, a little bit more tech slanted companies, maybe where they have succeeded pretty well, I think the challenge sometimes then also is if you just translate that program to an organization where people don't have this natural IT background, right? You just have a very different set of people because the company might be doing something very different and not IT-like in nature, right? Then like it just doesn't work for them because you can't expect everybody to be in the same context than they are in, let's say, a more tech-oriented company. And I think that's another thing that people sometimes kind of don't quite accept. Like you said in the beginning, right? There's no simple way how you can say, well, just do it like this and it's going to work. Right?
Yeah.
So it very much depends on where you try to do it.
Yeah, I mean, my last experience at Expedia Group, I saw this a lot, right? I mean, it's a lot of different kinds of travel products. It's an old business to some extent. I mean, travel's obviously very old, but even Expedia Group's been around a long time. And it's like you take one word like itinerary, what does that mean? And you go across different lines of business. I mean, it means a lot of different things. So it's like, it's tricky to find shared terminology in a big complex business that fundamentally travel isn't really like naturally a digital business. It's still learning how to be digital. So yeah, I think it's a universal applicable thing. And I think even at the scale of like when I was at Typeform with, 100 to 200 people over the course of time being there, having that, this is our grammar, this is our language, this is how customers talk about forms, in that case, super digital concepts, right? It was useful, just so that we're all speaking the same language. Yeah, so not technical, doesn't seem like an API thing at all, but super obvious out of now, I think 10 people recorded and probably 8 published, super consistent, like probably 3/4 of the people asked say that.
Okay. Yeah, and I think, like you said, right? But I have to I have to disagree. I think it is an API thing because it is about interfaces, right? It is about understanding what is it even that you're doing, how do you want to expose it, how do you make it available to others, right? And then you need to talk about what it is.
I rambled a bit when I was talking about my son getting his CS degree, but I think there was a point I missed, which is I don't see anything design oriented in how that's all taught, right? Which is to say that I think it's an essential skill for, let's say, to get to that architect level in engineering, to be able to design a system that is comprehensible. And I think this is an essential skill in making that happen. The fact that we use APIs now is just a form factor. I think if you didn't have APIs and you're just designing interfaces, the same is true, right? Like, I mean, like we're 20 years down this design pattern road, and there's a lot of folks in shops I talk to that go like, I'm sick of these things because I can't remember what the frick it's supposed to do, right? Like, like it's just a bunch of stuff that doesn't mean anything. Can we make this easier to understand? It's like, systems are hard to understand, and the key to it is put that designer cap on and be empathetic to the customer and design around them, and then make it perform under the covers, right? Like further down in the stack somewhere. So yeah, that's the first big lesson for sure. And I think for me, super validating because that is very much my approach.
Okay, that I think is something, like I said, they've also seen quite a bit. Yep. Let's move on then.
Yep.
There is a second thing that you saw that was similarly consistent that was mentioned all the time.
For sure. I think probably half or more. I probably should have gone through and tallied all this up and had it scientific, but just
my spreadsheet
from my clearly not stellar memory. No, is defining an API style guide. It's really saying, there is, and by style guide, I should probably qualify that a bit to mean I think traditionally what folks have thought of as standards is in APIs, we're really saying that there's a mix of kind of conventions and expected parameters or, expected security or identity patterns, things like that. This is the kind of the flavor of how our API looks. And these days, I feel like more and more folks look around at all the different APIs and go, I want ours to look like that one. And so let's quantify what does that mean? And it's getting easier now because people are sharing and publishing style guides. Props to Arnaud Laurent, who shares his API style guide community-oriented site.
He's reworking it. It will become much better. I talked to him recently. There are good things on the horizon for this style.
I was supposed to talk to him.
Style book. Yes.
My spidey sense went off, and we were going to talk recently, but it's on the calendar soon. So obviously, this one resonated a lot for us with at Stoplight, right? Where you have a open source project, Spectral, that it's shocking, how many when we look through the people that are using it and the podcast too, with tripping across guests who, and I'm very much not shilling on that show. It's they'll go, we defined a style guide and all of a sudden it got way easier. We're not talking about conventions anymore. We just lint for it. It's baked into CI/CD or, we have automated checks and we're just talking about the meaty stuff. What does this mean? And then after the show, I'll go what are you using for the style guide thing? I go, Spectral, of course. And it's wow, it's, it's cool, right? It's really spread. So, and that's, it's an open source thing. It's, super useful, and I think has been super validating from the show that that is an essential ingredient.
I will link to the video that I don't know where the links will appear, that I made with Phil. So Phil was kind enough to talk about Spectral with me for a little while, and then I did a second one actually about how to use it. So I agree, Spectral is something that seems to be very much on the rise, and it very much is from that space of making it easier to do the right thing in the end.
Yeah, it's funny, right in the middle of starting to hear all this from podcast guests, we made it on the ThoughtWorks radar this year with Spectral as well, which was kind of a big moment of recognition, oh, wow, this is...
Congrats,
nice, Spectral might be bigger than Stoplight, right? But, it's like a whole syntax to learn. It's the whole thing. And I would say too, like if you have some other mechanism for doing it, great. Like I know when I was at PayPal, we built our own kind of linting stuff. But someone works pretty good. So I think we definitely for Stoplight, it's definitely been a lot of lessons in the last few months around how people are using this, why they're using it, and like how can we make it easier to use. Some of that you can't really necessarily make just work easy in the open source, but more when folks are coming onto our platform to build APIs, how do we make that kind of style guide checking for an organization and that sort of governance, enforcement, whatever, and quantification of like what's our maturity level based on that. Things like that are really kind of front of mind for us lately. But yeah, I think what's interesting is a lot of folks would go like, oh, having some like standards that are enforceable and all. Like, man, like we're a small company. I don't, that's not important. And it's funny. I don't, that's not true at all. And now it's easy enough to plug this stuff in. There's no reason not to from day one. Because why on earth would you want to have like, oops, we dumped a snake case parameter that should have been spine cased, right? Like it's just embarrassing. Don't do it,
Well, that's certainly true, but I even think like I tend to move away more and more from talking about enforcing and really talking more about, look, it makes it easier for people to be confident that what they're doing is correct, right? They don't like they get tooling, the tooling works nicely, the tooling scales to larger organizations, right? So this is all taken care of. So in the end, it really it's better for the developers and it's better for the organization. So there really is no downside, right? You just have to start using it. That's basically it.
Totally. And I mean, I think there has to be some method of kind of governing your APIs. And if you don't, you're definitely going to make mistakes. And granted, I mean, like, Stoplight, we're a small place. We don't have like, a dedicated person that we're paying to look at all the APIs. It's to some extent an effort between teams to cross-check each other. But let's not have a discussion about what the convention should be. Let's define that and be done with it and not waste breath on it more than once. Let's talk about, does this, again, back to language, does this concept make sense in light of the bigger platform, right? Let's have that discussion, not all the, down in the weeds, silly stuff. And let's figure out how auth works, define it, apply it everywhere, and make sure everybody's doing it the same way. Let's not waste breath on that one again, because it sucks every time, right?
Yes. And because you said, they may decide to have governance, or I don't know exactly how you phrase it, but to me, it's a little bit like with communications, right? People also say you can't communicate. And I think with governance, it's the same thing. Even if you don't do anything, that's also a style of governance that will have certain results, right? And the results may not be the ones that you like.
That's true.
So just by not doing it, right, it's not that you say, well, then I'm saving money on governance and I don't know, that's good, right? It's like, no, you get a result out of that, and that actually may cost you more in the long run.
It's actually a perfect segue to the third and final point, and I think a briefer one, so we don't, rabbit on forever here. Which is like in large organizations, you got to have some central function for doing it, which in some cases could be incredibly small. I'll hold up the example of eBay, which I don't think that one's published yet, but I'll give a preview that like it's literally one person responsible for defining all this kind of stuff. But that obviously is horribly impossible with tens of thousands of people, and there's probably 10,000 plus developers, right? And so that's be decentralized or kind of federated in the approach to that governance. And I think it's something that makes sense at any scale. So when you're really small, you don't have the resources to go have a dedicated person. It's not even a full-time job. It doesn't make sense. And at some point, as you're scaling up, maybe it does. But if you're starting from the basis that each of your kind of, domains or functional spaces, whatever, has some kind of subject matter expert who gets the APIs, gets your kind of, standards or style guide or whatever, and that those folks are getting together, or at least bouncing things off of each other and cross-checking stuff in some structured fashion, has got to be there from the beginning. And it scales, right? I mean, the fact that an organization as large as eBay can have one full-time person and then everything else is decentralized, like, it scales. As where if you try to throw this like big, heavy central function and no one else is really responsible, but they have to pass through a gate, like, and that's where, to me, like, governance has a bad connotation because of the history of those approaches. But I think if that's what you're doing when you hear governance, you're doing it wrong, right? Like, be decentralized in your approach was kind of the consistent thing we hear.
I very much like what you just said, that governance has kind of a bad sound to it, or when people hear it, they have a bad connotations of it, because it sounds like bureaucracy and slow and limiting and all these kind of things. But like you said, it's just a way of how it can be done, and it can be done differently. I really like Matthew Reinbold's definition of governance. He once told me governance is a process to facilitate change.
Yeah.
And I really like that definition, also because it's just positive. That's a good start.
Yeah.
But also because it says, right, the goal is not to prevent things from happening. The goal is to make sure that the things that you want to happen actually happen, and to figure out how you can make them happen, hopefully in the most effective way. And like you said, in large organizations, decentralization definitely is the way to go. And I'm really looking forward now to that episode of yours. When is it coming out?
Oh gosh, I should have had the schedule in front of me. So
Okay,
we publish every 2 weeks, and I want to say it's coming up. It's probably end of July, middle of August is my guess.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the last thought on that one is I've certainly read a fair bit of stuff that, like, this center of excellence model that companies will apply, which, is always kind of like a negative connotation, right? Like, you're all not excellent enough. You have to come through us to be excellent. That just the difference in thinking toward, like, enablement, right? And it's like when I was at PayPal, the way we always put it to folks is like, yes, we have this group here to, define all this API design stuff, but we're here to make you look cool, right? Like, you don't have to know all the rules. You don't have to know all the stuff. We've got the tools. We've got the experience, and we have some notion of what everyone else in the company is doing. So we'll make you look consistent. So having an enabling approach is definitely a key factor too. And that's to say, be careful with who you put in that central function. If you have someone who has that old school model, and that, I'm cooler, I'm cooler than you, and or I'm better than you, and you have to pass my judgment, as opposed to I'm here to consult with you and help you succeed. Just that difference in philosophy makes all the difference in successful governance.
Absolutely. But luckily, I've seen that the Center of Excellence label seems to definitely be giving way to a Center for Enablement. Yeah. So at least in terms of the label that people are using, it's getting better.
But hey, how did we start the show? By saying that language is everything, right? Like, if you and it's part of why it's so important, because the intent behind or at least how we all perceive a given word can completely change the meaning of what it is that we produce. So, pretty fluffy stuff, but it's real.
Yes, it definitely is real. And I think, like you said, then it also starts to change the mindset, right? So if then the Center for Enablement actually focuses on enabling people and being more decentralized and accepting everybody's opinions, right? Being more, the way I like to put it is, for the guidelines, for example, like, mostly you should be the editor, right? You're not writing them. You're just making sure that they actually are compiled and made available in consumable form. But that's your main job, right?
Yeah,
your job is not, like, you're not the Pope. That's not the.
That's a curator. I think every engagement you learn something from. And you got it. I mean, like at PayPal, we had a long-standing backlog of kind of curation items to go tend to. And very few of those were things that we thought up. It was just, when you engage with somebody, you learn a new domain space, you learn some gap where something wasn't clear, or whatever. And we figured out in discussion, but we'd always capture, hey, there was something that required discussion that wasn't, you couldn't learn it on your own. So completely agree. Yeah, that kind of, you're a curator of what consistency looks like.
Okay. Jason, thanks so much for all these insights. Can you give us your executive summary of these 3 points once again? Just your
absolutely.
3 main takeaways from the API intersection.
Yeah, I think one is have some kind of consistent grammar or vocabulary that's customer centric in nature. Define a consistent style guide for your organization to define basically all your kind of basic conventions and stuff. And be decentralized in your governance approach. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining. I think that was an excellent summary and some really interesting things you took away from that first season of the API intersection, and I'm definitely looking forward to a second season, assuming. So we talked a little bit, so you're saying you will change your approach a little bit, but the second season is definitely in the making?
Yeah, I mean, we don't really have defined seasons. I think it's more that like with a quarter of retrospective now and looking back on how's this gone, we were fishing for like, is there consistency in approach? There clearly is a significant amount of consistency in how people build successful API programs. And so I think we'll start to take deeper dives on specific subjects now, as opposed to kind of how does your whole program work? That way we can go deeper on specific subjects where these particular guests are maybe really excellent at that subject. So should be a little shift in approach coming up, and hopefully keep the time factor down. I know everyone struggles to listen to all their podcasts, so try to trim down the time a little bit too. But as we sit here, right, it's too fun to talk with API geeks, so we have to constrain it.
That definitely also is one of the problems I always have. I always try to keep things short, and then it's just too interesting and they get long. But that's
totally.
How it is.
I get it.
Thanks so much for another interesting and long conversation, Jason. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I look forward to your next set of episodes coming out soon.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.